The grizzly bear stood upright in the middle of the river, so tall it blocked the cliff behind it. Facing it was a dark brown furred Bigfoot, also raising its long arms. Between them, a Chinook salmon thrashed on the rocks. The bear charged first. The Bigfoot leaned away from the claws, then struck with such force that the water exploded as if a boulder had fallen into it. I lay pressed behind a tree trunk, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped the camera. Then the creature suddenly turned its head and looked straight at where I was hiding. Hello everyone, I'm Victor, and welcome back to Bigfoot Sasquatch Story. Today's story takes us to Brooks River, Alaska, during the salmon run, where hundreds of grizzly bears gather to feed, and where many strange stories have long been told about giant creatures living deep in the forest. This story was collected and compiled by our editorial team from different sources, including forums, personal blogs, oral accounts, local documents, and Bigfoot research communities. We cannot fully verify whether this was a real event or only a modern legend, so listen with an open mind. Before we begin, comment Bigfoot if you believe there are still things hidden in the deep forest that humans have not fully discovered. In September 2021, Daniel Carter, a retired high school teacher and experienced fisherman, returned to Brooks River in Katmai National Park, Alaska, for his annual trip during the salmon run. Daniel always believed in what could be observed and verified, so he viewed stories about Bigfoot in Alaska as products of imagination. One fog-covered morning, Daniel heard a violent fight upstream. When he secretly approached, he witnessed a male Bigfoot fighting a grizzly bear over a salmon. Curiosity pushed Daniel to follow the creature into the forest, where he discovered it was carrying food back to a female Bigfoot and two young ones. That discovery completely changed the way he saw the legendary creature. However, when the wind shifted, Daniel was discovered. During his escape, he injured his ankle and became trapped between the Bigfoot family's territory and the returning grizzly. Instead of attacking Daniel, the male Bigfoot deliberately led the bear away, saving his life. Afterward, Daniel found a salmon left on a rock like either a gift or a warning. Daniel returned with video clips and footprint photos, but he chose to stay silent to protect the creature's family. 1 year later, he returned to Brooks River and received a sign that the Bigfoot still remembered him. Before we continue, comment the name of the city or state where you live. I want to know how far this story can travel, and if you were the man in this story, what would you do? On the afternoon of September 17, 2021, the floatplane touched down on the surface of Knockneck Lake in a series of light shudders, bringing Daniel Carter back to Brooks Camp after a year of postponing the trip because of family matters. When he stepped onto the wooden dock, he paused to look at the gray waves stretching under the cold wind. Then he took a waterproof notebook from his jacket pocket and wrote down the temperature, wind direction, and landing time in small, even handwriting. 30 years of fishing had turned those habits into a natural part of every trip. While tourists near the lake shore excitedly took photos, Daniel opened his gear bag and checked his fishing line, tackle box, warning whistle, bear spray, chest-mounted camera, and radio. He had always believed careful preparation offered more safety than blind luck in the Alaskan wilderness. Mark Ellis, a guide who had met him the previous season, came over to shake his hand and asked about the knee that had forced Daniel to shorten last year's fishing trip. Daniel smiled, took a few test steps on the dock, and said it was strong enough to survive another salmon season. Mark said Chinook and sockeye were gathering thickly upstream, drawing in several large male bears that had been fighting around the shallow runs. He reminded Daniel not to go past the bend with the warning sign, especially because a bear with a white scar across its muzzle had chased a film crew away from the riverbank 2 days earlier. While helping Daniel place his bags on a cart, Mark lowered his voice and said, The rangers had found several spruce branches twisted nearly 3 meters above the ground. A tourist overheard and joked about Bigfoot. Daniel smiled and said strong wind, bears standing on their hind legs, and human imagination often created lasting legends. Mark replied that bears usually left claw marks, while those branches looked as if they had been twisted by a giant hand. Before leaving the dock, he also mentioned a fish crate weighing nearly 90 kilograms that had been dragged from storage during the night. Around the damp ground were only a few long depressions. Daniel kept his calm expression. But when he reached the cabin, he saw 3 muddy streaks higher than a person's head on the wooden wall and measured them longer than he had planned. Near midnight, Daniel woke to a deep knock echoing from the forest behind the cabin. The sound came 3 times, each knock a few seconds apart, steady and heavy, as if someone were striking a tree trunk with a large piece of wood. He sat up, listened in the dark, then reached over and turned off the small bedside lamp so the window glass would reflect less. Outside, only thin mist drifted between the spruce trunks, and the pale yellow light from the main building glowed far away. Daniel waited for the scrape of claws on dirt, the snort of a bear, or the familiar heavy steps of wildlife. But the forest held a silence that made him more uneasy than any noise. Another knock suddenly answered from deeper in the woods. A few seconds later, the first sound came again, this time closer to the cabin. Daniel took his flashlight and walked to the door, but stopped with his hand just above the latch. Years of experience reminded him that opening a door to satisfy curiosity in the middle of an Alaskan night was usually a terrible decision. He placed a small audio recorder against the window, then looked through the gap in the curtain. A tall shadow moved across the open space between 2 trees. Daniel switched on the flashlight and swept the beam across that area, but saw only a few branches trembling before falling still again. He checked the door lock, studied the wooden porch, and told himself it could have been a ranger on patrol or a small tree falling. When he replayed the audio, Daniel clearly heard the first 3 knocks. In the silence between them, there was also a low, drawn-out sound, like breath coming from a very large chest. He raised the volume. The breath ended with a short rumble that felt like a call held back in the throat. Daniel turned off the recorder, set it on the table, then turned it back on a few seconds later to listen again. Just as he returned to bed, a pebble struck the cabin roof, rolled across the edge of the metal, and dropped onto the porch. The next morning, Daniel found the stone near the step. It was wet and covered in green moss, completely different from the dry gravel around the cabin. He stared toward the forest for a long time, feeling for the first time that this familiar place was silently watching him. On the morning of September 18, Daniel left the cabin at 5:30, when the sky above Naknek Lake had only just begun fading from black. The cold air turned his breath into short white trails in front of him, and the path toward Brooks River was covered in low mist that made every tree trunk look farther away than it really was. He carried his fishing rod, tackle box, chest-mounted camera, and bear spray as he had on every earlier trip. But the moss-covered stone still sat in his jacket pocket, though he did not fully know why he had brought it. Mark waited at the head of the trail, checked the safety clip on his bear spray, and reminded Daniel again about the male bear with the white scar on its muzzle. 2 days earlier, it had chased a filming group away from the riverbank, and yesterday morning it had appeared near the bend upstream. Daniel nodded, promised to stay inside the permitted fishing area, and continued with 2 other visitors toward the familiar stretch of river. The water was cold enough to cut through his waders, but the dark red sockeye crowding through the shallows quickly made him forget the numbness. As Daniel prepared to cast for the first time, he noticed the fish in front of him suddenly shift to one side, leaving an empty pocket of water close to the opposite bank. He looked into the forest, where willow brush stood motionless in the fog, then told himself a bear might be hiding behind the trees. A few minutes later, a female bear with 2 cubs stepped out downstream. Daniel reeled in, backed away from their line of travel, and kept distance until all 3 disappeared behind the rocks. His calm reaction encouraged the 2 nearby visitors to keep fishing, but Daniel continued watching the opposite bank. In the wet mud that had just been exposed, he saw a long depression with a heel and 5 faint toe marks. Its size was far beyond a human footprint, but its shape did not match a bear's foot either. Water from the river edge quickly ran into it, erasing the outline before he could cross to examine it. Daniel stayed where he was, though curiosity made his hand tighten around the fishing rod. The camera on his chest silently recorded a tall shadow on the far side. At that moment, a bear's roar rolled down from upstream. Only a few seconds later, a deeper sound answered, making birds in the spruce tops burst into the fog all at once. Daniel stood still in the water, feeling the second sound echo through his chest more than through his ears. The bear's roar was familiar to him, heavy and sharp, but the sound that answered lasted longer, so deep that the water around his knees seemed to tremble. A few seconds later, from upstream came the sound of trees breaking, water splashing violently, and heavy impacts like 2 large logs being thrown into each other. Daniel reeled in by reflex, eyes still fixed on the bend hidden in fog. According to Brooks' camp rules, he should have left the river, returned to the trail, and informed the rangers that 2 large animals were fighting near the fishing area. He had planned to do exactly that, until a rush of salmon suddenly shot downstream, pushing past his boots as if fleeing something. Fresh strips of bark and green willow branches appeared on the water, carried down by the current. Daniel stepped onto the bank, placed his fishing rod beside a spruce root, checked his bear spray, and switched on the camera mounted to his chest. He set a clear limit for himself. He would only go as far as the warning sign at the bend, observe from a distance, then come back. The trail ahead was damp and narrow, but just before the sign, a young tree had fallen across the path. Its trunk had been broken almost 2 meters high. The fresh break was pale, with no bite marks or claw marks around it. A suppressed rumble rose ahead, followed by the harsh scream of a bear. Daniel crouched low and moved along the forest edge to avoid exposing himself on the open path. He remembered Mark's warning about the white scarred bear and paused for several breaths, his hand resting on the bear spray. Just as he prepared to turn back, a large shadow flashed through a gap between 2 willow bushes ahead. The creature moved on 2 legs, back straight, wearing no backpack and no hat, its height far above the low branches around it. Daniel stepped to the broken tree and found a clump of long brown hair caught on the scratched bark. Before he could touch it, another impact sounded. Daniel moved behind a large spruce, looked through the branches, and saw the white scarred bear standing in the river, facing a massive figure covered in dark brown fur and dripping cold water. Daniel pressed himself against the spruce trunk, slowing his breathing as the scene ahead became clear through the mist. The white scarred bear stood in the shallow river, its gray-brown coat clumped heavily with water. The creature facing it was more than 2.5 meters tall, with shoulders as wide as the tree trunk behind it and long arms hanging low near its knees. Between them, a Chinook salmon thrashed on the stones, its silver scales reflecting the early sky. The bear lowered its head and circled left, eyes never leaving the fish. The Bigfoot turned with it, keeping its body between the rival and the prize. Every movement was cautious, as if it understood that one mistake could end the confrontation. The bear suddenly charged, front paws throwing white water into the air. The Bigfoot leaned aside and drove one arm hard into the bear's shoulder, making both giants slide on the wet rocks before separating. Daniel's hand squeezed the tree trunk until it hurt, The bear turned back faster than he expected and swung its claws through the space beside the Bigfoot's arm, tearing away a patch of dark brown fur. The creature released a deep rumble, so powerful that droplets on leaves near Daniel began to tremble. It bent and picked up a rock, but instead of throwing it at the bear, it slammed the rock into the water in front of its opponent. The impact rang across both banks, forcing the bear back for a moment. Daniel realized the act was more warning than attack. The Bigfoot wanted distance. It wanted to end the fight before either one was badly hurt. The bear still moved toward the fish, slower but determined. The Bigfoot suddenly stepped forward in 2 long strides, dropped one shoulder, and rammed into the bear's side. Both massive bodies crashed into the river, scattering salmon around them. The bear stood first, shook its head, then looked at its opponent with more caution. The Bigfoot stood too, the scratched arm pressed tight to its side, but its eyes remained locked on each movement the bear made. After several tense seconds, the bear turned and snatched another fish trapped between 2 stones. It backed toward the bank with its prey and disappeared into the forest. The Bigfoot stayed still until the sound vanished. Only then did it bend and pick up the Chinook. Daniel thought the creature would eat it right there. Instead, it held the fish against its chest, looked toward the eastern forest, and walked quickly into the trees. Curiosity overpowered the warning in his mind. Daniel switched on his camera, left his hiding place, and followed, while the white-scarred bear remained somewhere very close. The Bigfoot left the river with long but unhurried steps, the Chinook salmon still held tightly in its wet fur-covered arms. Daniel waited until the creature disappeared behind the willows before leaving his hiding place. He kept enough distance for his footsteps to blend with the sound of the water. He knew the decision to follow went against every rule that had kept him safe in the wilderness. But the chance in front of him was too great to turn away from. Daniel turned his chest camera to continuous recording, then checked his GPS watch and memorized the direction back to the riverbank. The signal was weak because of the cliffs and thick canopy, but the device still showed the correct position. The Bigfoot did not choose the easiest route. It stepped across rocks, roots, and strips of firm ground, avoiding soft mud that could hold footprints. Whenever it reached a high ledge, the creature stopped, lifted its head to listen, then looked behind it. Daniel had to press himself against a tree and keep his body motionless until the figure continued moving. Once, the toe of his boot snapped a dry branch. The sound made the Bigfoot turn almost immediately. Daniel hid behind a spruce, fingers gripping the camera strap, while the creature stared toward him for several long seconds. The wind still blew from the Bigfoot toward Daniel, keeping his scent from reaching it. When the creature turned away, Daniel finally breathed out and realized his palm was cold and wet. He tried calling on the radio, but the speaker only produced broken static. His satellite phone was still in the bag beside his fishing rod because he had never thought he would move this far from the river. Daniel looked back toward the way he had come and reminded himself this was the right time to stop. However, the Bigfoot lifted the fish to smell it, looked toward the eastern forest, then changed direction, as if protecting the food from some other danger. Daniel kept going. On a nearby tree, he found a muddy handprint with 5 clear fingers, nearly twice the size of his own hand. When Daniel crouched to photograph it, a knock sounded ahead. Immediately, a second knock answered from the right, making him understand he may have stepped into the territory of more than one creature. Daniel stood frozen behind the tree, listening to the 2 knocks that had just sounded from different directions. The Bigfoot ahead stopped too. It set the salmon on a rock, picked up a rotten piece of wood, and knocked twice against the nearest spruce trunk. From the slope on the right came one short answer. Then the forest returned to such deep silence that Daniel could hear water dripping from leaves onto moss under his feet. The creature lifted the fish again, changed course, and avoided a narrow stream directly in front of it. Daniel waited several seconds, then followed its path. When he reached the stream, he understood why the creature had changed direction. In the soft mud were many fresh bear tracks. The ground around the edge was still wet, and a pile of scat under the willow had not cooled. The Bigfoot had apparently received a warning from another individual about danger ahead. Daniel began watching the open spaces between tree trunks, instead of focusing only on the figure carrying the fish. A low branch trembled lightly on the slope, then stopped before he could identify what had passed. A pine cone dropped beside Daniel's shoulder. He looked up but saw no squirrel or bird. A second cone fell on the opposite side, making him turn by reflex. In that instant, a streak of lighter fur slipped behind a cluster of trees about 30 meters away. The figure was shorter than the male Bigfoot and disappeared. So fast Daniel wondered if the fog had fooled his eyes. He stepped back, understanding for the first time that he might be standing among multiple individuals communicating with one another. His GPS watch lost signal, and the arrow pointing back kept changing direction. Ahead, the male Bigfoot stopped on a low ridge and looked behind longer than before. Daniel pressed himself low into the cold mud, keeping his breathing shallow and slow. The creature raised its nose to smell the air, but the wind still moved from it toward him. After a long, tense moment, it turned and walked deeper into the forest. Daniel had just begun to stand when branches cracked behind him. He slowly turned, looking back along the route he had taken. He saw only empty forest, while the camera on his chest had already captured a dark face hidden among leaves for less than a second. The terrain ahead began rising, forcing Daniel to place each step carefully on slick roots and moss-covered stone. The male Bigfoot slowed, holding the salmon close to its chest so the tail would not hit tree trunks or drag through the mud. At a fork, the creature did not choose the shorter path on the left. Instead, it looped around a low slope. Daniel stopped to observe and quickly understood why. A rotten trunk blocked the shorter path at a height the large creature could have stepped over easily. But the fish held in both hands might have fallen into the mud below. That small choice made Daniel feel that every movement of the Bigfoot had a clear purpose. On a patch of soft earth near the rocks, he found many overlapping footprints. The largest track line belonged to the male carrying the fish. Beside it was a smaller line, and in the middle were 2 rows of prints, only half the length of an adult human foot. The small tracks often stayed between the 2 larger lines, like children being kept in a safe zone while moving through the forest. Some prints had been covered with dry leaves, but the leaves were too neatly placed for Daniel to believe the wind had done it. He knelt, placed his folding knife beside one small print for scale, and took a photo. The heel, toes, and depth appeared clearly in the mud. Nearby, one small print had slipped to the side. Beside it was a hand mark in the dirt, with 5 separate fingers. The detail instantly chilled Daniel's spine. He studied the trail for a long time, feeling his original curiosity slowly turn into caution. From ahead came a short sound, higher than the male Bigfoot's call. The creature immediately lifted its head, tightened its grip on the fish, and sped up. The sound came again, this time with a light scratching against stone, making Daniel think of an individual waiting for food or in some kind of difficulty. He had meant to stop before intruding deeper, but on a low branch beside the path, a faded blue strip of cloth had been tied in a simple knot. Daniel touched the edge of the cloth and recognized the material as something from human gear. When he looked up, the Bigfoot had vanished behind a rock wall, while small sounds from the ravine beyond suggested several creatures were waiting for its return. Daniel moved closer to the rock wall, where thick willows concealed a narrow passage between 2 slopes. At first, he thought the small trees in front of him had simply been knocked down by wind and tangled together. But when he looked closely, he saw many branches had been bent in the same direction and wedged beneath flat stones. The arrangement formed a natural screen to hide the open space behind it from anyone passing by. The male Bigfoot bent, lifted a large branch, and stepped through the opening. After entering, it placed the branch back exactly where it had been, so carefully that the dry leaves below shifted only slightly. Daniel stood outside for a minute, listening to his own breathing and wondering whether he had gone too far just to get more footage. In the end, he climbed onto a low rock ledge on the left instead of going through the main passage, hoping he could observe without disturbing the shelter. From that position, a dry patch of ground appeared between two rock walls, protected from the wind by crossed trunks. Dry leaves, soft grass, and spruce branches had been arranged into two nests against the wall. Fish bones and used bark had been gathered neatly into one corner. A female Bigfoot stepped out first. She was shorter than the male, but still taller than any adult human. Brown-gray fur covered her body, and her left leg moved more stiffly and slowly than her right. Two young Bigfoots ran from behind the rock wall, but stopped when the female stretched an arm across them. The male Bigfoot placed the salmon on the ground. One young one reached to touch the still thrashing tail, but the male gently pulled it back as if reminding it to wait. Daniel lifted the camera, but his hand trembled enough for the frame to drift away from the family before him. The female Bigfoot came closer, touched the scratched arm of the male, then bent to smell the wet fur. She made a short sound in her throat, and the male answered with a low vibration, making Daniel understand they were communicating. Near the leaf nest, one young Bigfoot picked up an old metal lid and used the sharp edge to lightly scrape salmon scales. That moment made Daniel realize he was looking at a family that cared for one another, waited their turn, and used tools in its own way. When he shifted his foot to see more clearly, a stone under his boot suddenly rolled down the gap, hit the rock wall, and made every creature below lift its head at once. After the stone struck the wall, the entire Bigfoot family froze. The male immediately turned toward the high slope, his whole body tightening, while the female pulled the two young ones close against the rock wall. Daniel lay flat on the ledge, holding the camera against his chest and trying to slow his breathing. For several long, heavy seconds, the male stared directly toward his hiding place. But the low brush and the wind direction still concealed Daniel's presence. When the upper area remained quiet, the male returned to the salmon, though his sitting position changed. He placed his back toward his family and faced the entrance, like a father choosing the more dangerous side for himself. The male Bigfoot used a sharp stone to cut the skin along the belly of the fish, then separated the meat into portions. The first piece was given to the female, but the female pushed the meat toward the two young ones, making the male divide it into smaller pieces. The smallest young one held the food with both hands and bit so fast that fish juices ran down its chin. The older young one ate more slowly, then placed part of the meat near its mother's foot. The gesture made Daniel lower his camera for a moment. Before him was a family sharing a meal in the harsh wilderness, completely different from the image of a food-fighting monster he had imagined only minutes earlier at the river. The male Bigfoot began eating only after the two young ones had enough. It chewed slowly, occasionally lifting its head to check the forest, while keeping the scratched arm tight against its side. Daniel remembered each dodge, each moment when the creature had stood between the bear and the fish, and understood that all the danger at the river had been for the purpose of bringing food back here. That thought made him feel more like an intruder than an explorer. He decided to leave before curiosity pushed everything too far. Daniel shifted his knee, preparing to back away from the rock ledge, but the moss under his hand slipped slightly. He managed to keep balance, but the movement shook several blades of grass. At the same moment, the wind inside the ravine changed, carrying the smell of sweat and his damp jacket down into the sheltered ground below. The male Bigfoot stopped chewing. It lifted its head, widened its nostrils, and looked straight up toward the ledge. After one silent beat, the creature set its food down and stood. Its face held cold focus, eyes locked on the place where Daniel lay. Then, with a speed that did not give him time to lift his hand from the camera, the Bigfoot charged up the slope. Daniel backed away. His foot slipped off the mossy edge, and his whole body fell down the rocky slope behind him. Daniel slid off the mossy edge, his back striking a raised rock before he rolled farther down the slope. He tried to grab nearby roots, but his hands only pulled loose dirt and rotten leaves. After nearly 6 meters, his right shoulder hit a spruce root, stopping his body in a shallow trench filled with cold mud. The camera on his chest snapped out of place and swung to the side, still hanging from the strap. Daniel lay motionless for a moment, checking whether he could still move. When he pushed himself upright, sharp pain shot from his right ankle up to his knee. He tried putting weight on the foot, but the leg gave out, forcing him to lean against the tree root. The ankle began swelling under the thick sock, though its shape did not suggest a broken bone. Daniel understood he could still crawl or brace himself against trees, but running was no longer possible. On the slope above, the Bigfoot appeared among shaking branches. It stood still and looked down, wet fur covering its shoulders and arms, eyes focused on every movement the man below made. Daniel pulled the bear spray from his belt, removed the safety clip, and held it before his chest. His arm shook so hard the nozzle drifted away from the target. The wind was blowing across the slope, meaning using the spray could push it back into his own face. The Bigfoot began descending. It placed each foot on solid patches of stone, moving slowly but very quietly. Daniel backed away on his elbows until his back pressed fully against the root. He looked at the spray in his hand, then at the creature coming closer, and realized one wrong reaction might turn caution into an attack. After several seconds of hesitation, he set the bear spray on the ground in front of him, and kept both hands open to show he did not intend to fight. The Bigfoot stopped about 5 meters away. It looked at the bear spray, then at the camera still blinking red, then straight into Daniel's eyes. It bent down, picked up a long branch, and pushed the bear spray out of Daniel's reach. Then the creature took one more step forward, lowering its body until its massive face was almost level with the eyes of the trapped man. At less than 5 meters away, Daniel could see the creature's face more clearly than anything he had ever seen in blurry Bigfoot photos. Its forehead was low, jaw broad, nose flat, and dark brown fur framed its cheeks, but its eyes were amber brown, moving slowly and with focus, as if weighing each of his reactions. The Bigfoot tilted its head when it heard Daniel's rushed breathing, then lowered its gaze to the swollen ankle inside the boot. That gesture made Daniel understand the creature had recognized his condition. Daniel swallowed, kept both hands open before his chest, and said in a low voice that he would leave as soon as he could stand. He knew his words might mean nothing to it, but a calm tone was the only thing he could still control. The Bigfoot released a soft vibration from its throat. From the ravine behind it, the female immediately answered with a short sound. The male turned his head, released 2 deep sounds in response, and the forest became quiet again, as if the warning had been passed along. Daniel slowly moved his hand toward the camera lying beside him. The Bigfoot's shoulders tightened at once. He stopped, removed the strap with small movements, and placed the device on the ground. The red light on the camera body continued blinking. The Bigfoot looked down, touched the plastic casing with one thick finger, and made the frame shake hard. Daniel thought it would crush the camera. Instead, the creature simply turned it face down so the lens pointed into the mud. That simple act chilled him. The Bigfoot might not understand the mechanism of recording, but it recognized the object was connected to watching its family. The creature stood again, pointed one finger at Daniel's eyes, then lowered that hand toward the camera, lying face down. Daniel followed the gesture and felt a message clearer than any roar. It knew he had seen too much. Just as he prepared to nod, a violent roar came from the forest. The sound was closer and heavier than before. The Bigfoot instantly turned. From the ravine came the frightened calls of the two young ones, and Daniel realized the white scarred bear had followed the smell of fish and returned. The roar from the forest made the male Bigfoot upright immediately, all attention shifting from Daniel to the ravine. Behind the rock wall, the two young Bigfoots made short, rapid sounds, while the female pulled them deeper into the shelter and used branches to hide part of the entrance. Daniel looked at the grass, bending in front of him, and understood the situation was becoming more dangerous by the second. Cold air was blowing out from the ravine into the forest, carrying the scent of salmon, the scent of the Bigfoot family, and the sweat on his own jacket. The white scarred bear may not have seen them yet, but it was following a clear scent trail. The male Bigfoot took several steps toward the forest, then looked back at Daniel. Its eyes stopped on the swollen ankle, as if it understood the man in front of it could not leave the area by himself. Daniel tried reaching for the bear spray, but the canister lay out of reach after being pushed aside. The Bigfoot watched the movement, then picked up a stone and threw it hard in the opposite direction. The rock struck a tree, creating a loud sound that made the bear moving through the willows pause and turn its head a few steps away. Daniel almost believed the plan had worked, but the bear raised its muzzle, smelled the air, and returned to the old track. Its gray-brown back appeared between two trees, each step bringing it closer to the ravine. The male Bigfoot looked toward his family, then suddenly released a thunderous roar, deliberately revealing his position. The bear turned completely toward him, ears lifting, its body changing direction away from the ravine entrance. The Bigfoot ran across the open space, moving fast enough for the bear to see, then headed toward the river. The bear answered with its own roar and chased, scattering rotten leaves underfoot. Before disappearing behind the trees, the male Bigfoot picked up a long branch and threw it near Daniel. The branch landed less than an arm's length away, strong enough to use as a walking stick. That choice left Daniel stunned, because only minutes earlier he had believed the creature might kill him. As the chase sounds faded, Daniel watched the direction the creature had gone and understood it had led the bear away from its family, while also pulling danger away from a helpless, injured stranger. Daniel pulled the branch the Bigfoot had left toward him, planted one end into the soil, and tried to stand. Pain immediately stabbed through his right ankle, forcing him to place almost all his weight on the other leg. He managed only a few steps before his breathing grew heavy, but the ability to move by himself brought a rare sense of relief in the strange forest. From the ravine behind him came a rustle of leaves. The female Bigfoot stepped out, keeping enough distance to observe Daniel, while the two young ones hid behind her legs. Daniel lowered his eyes, avoiding direct staring, and slowly turned his body to show he was preparing to leave. The female remained still. Her left leg was stiff and slower than her right, a sign that made Daniel understand why the male carried most of the burden of finding food. One young one stepped forward with curiosity, but the female stretched a hand across its chest to stop it. Daniel bent to pick up the camera lying face down in the mud. The female immediately made a warning sound, shoulders rising, eyes shifting to the device in his hand. Daniel stopped, removed the memory card from the camera, and placed the device on the ground. He held the memory card between two fingers, looked at it for several seconds, then placed it on a flat stone between them. The act was more like a concession than any explanation he could give. The female looked at the card, then at Daniel. The older young one stepped forward, bent to smell the small black object, but its mother called it back. After hesitating, the female came forward, picked up the memory card between two fingers, and placed it inside a rock crack near the shelter entrance instead of crushing it. Daniel did not understand the meaning of that choice. Maybe she wanted to keep the object that had recorded her family. Maybe she only wanted to move the suspicious thing out of Daniel's reach. Either way, the fact that she did not attack gave Daniel a chance to leave. He leaned on the branch, turned toward the river, and started downhill. The female watched for a few more seconds, then led the two young ones back into the ravine. Just before disappearing behind the branches, the smallest young one looked back at Daniel. Far away, the sounds of the chase suddenly stopped. The female immediately turned toward the forest and released a long call. No sound answered. The silence made the whole forest feel heavy. The long silence made the female Bigfoot step fully out of the ravine, her eyes fixed on the part of the forest where the male had disappeared. She released a low call, waited several seconds, then repeated it with a longer sound. Only distant running water answered. The two young ones immediately became restless. The older one held onto its mother's arm, while the smaller one stepped toward the slope before being pulled back. Daniel leaned against the branch, watching their reaction and understanding. The male had not returned the way his family expected. He also realized the female could not easily leave the two young ones to search for her mate, especially with her left leg stiff and slow. Daniel pointed toward the river, then leaned on the branch and stepped downhill, as if showing he was leaving the shelter. The female watched him, then picked up a dry branch and knocked twice against a tree trunk. From very far away came a weak answer, so faint Daniel was not sure whether it was the male's signal or only a tree hitting stone. The female stood still for several seconds, then led the two young ones back into the ravine. Before disappearing behind the screen of branches, she bent and pulled leaves over the small footprints near the entrance, as if protecting the place still mattered, even though the male had not returned. Daniel turned downhill, trying to follow the sound of the river. Every step sent pain through his ankle, and wet soil kept sliding under the end of his branch. He took colored thread from his fishing repair kit and tied it around several low branches to mark the route. But the deeper he went, the more he saw branches broken in different directions. Those signs may have been the paths of the Bigfoot family, but to Daniel, they only made the forest harder to read. His GPS watch had lost signal completely, the screen frozen at a position from 18 minutes earlier. When he crossed a patch of soft mud, Daniel stopped before a large Bigfoot print. Overlapping its edge was a fresh bear track, claw marks clear, and water not yet pooled inside. He tightened his grip on the branch and looked around the brush. From the left came heavy breathing. Then the enormous brown back of a creature appeared between tree trunks, silently moving parallel to him. The distance between them stayed the same even when Daniel changed speed. Daniel stopped, holding the branch horizontally before his body, and watched the brown back moving between two spruces. The creature moved lower than the male Bigfoot, but its steps made almost no sound. Whenever Daniel pushed forward with the branch, the brown shadow also shifted parallel on the left, always far enough for the willows to hide its head. He listened for claws scraping soil, or the snorting breath of a bear, but heard only leaves being pushed aside and settling back into place. That made him think of a body moving on two legs rather than an animal crawling low. Daniel called softly, hoping the male Bigfoot had returned after leading the bear away. But the forest did not answer. A stone suddenly rolled out from the left and stopped in front of him. Daniel turned toward it just as a branch on the right shook hard. The feeling that more than one creature surrounded him made him tighten his grip on the staff. His bear spray had been left behind near the slope, and in his pocket he had only the whistle, folding knife, and a few fishing lines. He continued toward the sound of the river, trying to keep his pace steady so he would not show panic. On a ridge ahead, a small shadow suddenly appeared. The older Bigfoot young one stood between two bushes, fur lighter than its father's, eyes wide as it watched Daniel. The young one turned toward the forest and made a short call. The brown shadow on the left stopped, then slowly stood upright. The female Bigfoot stepped out. Her left leg was still stiff and slow, but her eyes studied every movement of the injured man. Daniel understood the mother and child were watching to make sure he left their territory, while perhaps also searching for the male who had not returned. The young one bent to smell a bush, then pulled out a clump of dark brown fur matted with mud. The female took it, brought it close to her nose, and released a deeper call. Her reaction showed the fur belonged to the male and had recently fallen there. From down the slope came a very weak answering sound. Daniel had just felt relief when the bear roared immediately after, so close that ravens burst from the treetops all at once. Daniel looked down the forest ravine where the roar had just echoed among the dense trees. The female Bigfoot immediately pulled the young one toward the higher slope, while Daniel leaned on the branch and followed the weak sound of the male. The route toward the river narrowed, with wet stone and fallen trunks stacked on both sides. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they saw the white scarred bear standing beside a rotten log. It lowered its head to smell dark brown fur caught on the bark. Beneath it was a small red smear soaking into the wood. Daniel realized the male Bigfoot had passed through here injured. Large footprints led toward a stream and continued toward the river, but the bear stood directly in the path. Daniel crouched, trying to stay behind a rock, while the cold wind shifted and carried his scent into the ravine. The bear lifted its muzzle, turned toward him, and stepped away from the log. The female Bigfoot retreated uphill, pulling the young one close. With her injured left leg, she would struggle to fight while protecting her child. Daniel understood that if he kept moving downhill, he might draw the bear away from them. But if he turned back, the animal might follow him to the ravine where the smaller young one was still hiding. He took the whistle from his pocket and threw it to the right, hoping the sound of it hitting stone would distract the bear. The whistle made only a short clack. The bear looked over briefly, then quickly turned back. Daniel picked up a rock and struck it repeatedly against the tree beside him. The bear shifted toward the sound, taking a few steps in his direction. At that moment, the young Bigfoot slipped on the slope, knocking loose a spray of small stones. The bear whipped around. The female Bigfoot stood upright and gave a strong roar to pull attention away from the young one. The bear turned its entire body toward her. Daniel gripped the branch, knowing the female could not hold out long. Before the bear moved any closer, another roar came from behind it. The male Bigfoot stepped between the trees, left shoulder hanging low, fur along its side matted with mud, but it still stood between the bear and its family. Daniel understood this confrontation would be more dangerous than the first. The white, scarred bear turned fully, lowered its head, and charged down the ravine toward the injured opponent. The male Bigfoot chose a completely different strategy from the first fight. Because its left shoulder hung low and threw one side of its body off balance, it retreated toward an area filled with fallen trunks, forcing the bear to narrow its angle of attack. The bear charged down into the ravine, front paws throwing mud and rotten leaves. The Bigfoot leaned behind a tree trunk, letting the bear's swiping blow strike thick bark instead of its injured side. The sound of claws scraping wood was sharp and cold. The female immediately pushed the young one higher, then picked up small stones and threw them near the bear. Each throw landed away from its body, but the repeated impacts made the animal turn and slow. Daniel realized the two creatures were working together. He picked up a stone and struck a tree on the opposite side to create another source of sound. The bear's attention shifted away from the male Bigfoot for a few seconds. That was enough time for the creature to run through a narrow gap and lead the bear toward steeper ground. The male Bigfoot stepped onto a rotten trunk wedged between two rocks, shifted his weight, then stomped hard. The log rolled down, blocking the path and forcing the bear to circle around the rock slope. The female Bigfoot pulled the young one away from the hillside, and Daniel leaned on the branch, trying to follow. His swollen ankle made him miss a step and fall to one knee. The young Bigfoot turned back to look, then dragged a small branch toward him, copying what the male had done earlier. Daniel took the branch and used the two pieces of wood to stand again. The young one's clumsy gesture surprised him, because even in danger, it had remembered how its father had helped a stranger. Behind them, the bear had crossed the log faster than expected. The male Bigfoot turned back to block it, but his body swayed to one side. Daniel reached under his jacket and touched the backup bear spray attached to his small pouch. He removed the safety clip, waited until the bear came closer, then shouted so the Bigfoot would move out of the direct line. The creature looked at him and stepped right at the right moment. Daniel pressed the nozzle and sprayed a cloud of deterrent with the wind. The bear stopped, shook its head violently, and retreated from the burning air. The group began pulling uphill, but the animal remained in the ravine, sniffing and searching for a way around. Seconds later, it shifted to the other, heading straight toward the ravine. The female Bigfoot released a panicked cry as she remembered the smaller young one was still hidden in the shelter above, behind the screen of branches. The female Bigfoot turned immediately, pulling the older young one up the slope toward the ravine shelter. The male Bigfoot tried to follow, but the injured left shoulder made each step heavy and slower. Daniel stood between the way down to the river and the climb back up, hearing water from below, and knowing that if he continued a little farther, he might find rangers or visitors. The safe route was right in front of him, while his swollen ankle made climbing back uphill a dangerous choice. He looked at the male Bigfoot. The creature looked back at him for one brief moment, then turned away and followed its family without waiting. Daniel planted both branches into the ground, took a deep breath, and decided to go back. He could not leave the smaller young one behind when he knew the bear was heading directly toward the shelter. Instead of climbing the steepest path, Daniel took a diagonal route across the soft slope, using tree roots to reduce pressure on his right foot. Ahead, the female Bigfoot kept giving long calls, each one more urgent than the last. The older young one ran close beside her, while the male stayed behind, occasionally stopping to listen for movement in the forest. When they neared the ravine, Daniel saw bear tracks pressed deep into the mud, all pointing toward the entrance hidden by branches. The female Bigfoot sped up despite her stiff left leg, and Daniel understood her fear had overpowered her pain. The branch screen before the ravine had been shoved out of place. Several small trunks lay broken on the ground, and part of the leaf nest had been pulled outside. The female rushed in, while the male stayed outside to study the tracks. Daniel waited for the smaller young one's call, but heard only a short panicked sound from the female. He moved closer and realized the shelter was empty. On the ground was a line of small footprints leading toward a narrow rear passage, behind the rock wall, a passage Daniel had not seen before. The male Bigfoot bent to smell the trail, then stepped into the hidden path. From deep inside came the weak cry of the young one, followed by the long sound of stones falling into a deep drop. Daniel tightened his grip on both branches and understood they had returned to the most dangerous place. The rear passage behind the ravine led Daniel and the Bigfoot family to a narrow ledge above deep water. The smaller young one was hanging from a cluster of roots below the edge, both feet kicking against the rock wall, but finding no hold. Each time it tried to pull itself up, more loose soil fell into the water below. The female Bigfoot stepped closer, then stopped when the rock under her feet cracked. Her weight could cause the ledge to collapse. The male tried circling to the right, but his injured left shoulder made it impossible for him to grip the wall securely. Daniel studied a small tree growing horizontally above the ledge and understood his body was lighter than the two adults. He removed the camera strap, wrapped one end around the tree, and tested the knot with both hands. Pain stabbed through his ankle as he lowered himself to the ground, but he still crawled inch by inch toward the edge. The female Bigfoot gripped the strap behind him, while the male held the tree so it would not pull free from the soft soil. Daniel dropped the loop near the young one. The little creature stared at the strange object, still clutching the roots with both hands and making weak cries. The older young one moved close to the ledge and released short sounds as if guiding its sibling. Finally, the smaller one let go with one hand, touched the strap, and gripped it tight. Daniel pulled, but the soil beneath his elbow suddenly slid away. His body tilted toward the drop, and in that instant, the male Bigfoot caught the back of his jacket and held him with the healthy arm. Daniel kept pulling until the smaller, young one reached the edge. The female bent down and held it tight against her chest, while the older young one pressed its head to its sibling's shoulder. Daniel lay gasping, feeling the male Bigfoot's hand still gripping his jacket for several seconds before letting go. The reunion had barely begun when branches broke at the entrance of the passage. The white scarred bear appeared at the stone opening, its body blocking the only route back into the forest. Behind it, water slammed against the rock wall, making the narrow ledge vibrate. The male Bigfoot looked down at the river below, then at Daniel, as if a dangerous choice had just formed in its mind. The white scarred bear advanced into the narrow passage, its massive body filling the gap between the two walls. The male Bigfoot stood in front, left shoulder hanging low, while the female kept both young ones close behind her. Daniel leaned against the wall, his right ankle swollen stiff, with only deep water behind him. He understood there was nowhere left to retreat. The male Bigfoot watched the bear, then looked down at the ledge, where a large slab of rock had cracked loose from the wall and rested unevenly across the path. Daniel followed its gaze and realized that if the slab slid down at the right moment, it could create a barrier large enough to hold the bear back. He picked up a small stone, tapped the crack, then pointed at the loose slab. The male Bigfoot turned to look at him. Daniel planted the branch into the ground and mimed pushing with both hands. The creature stepped aside and stomped hard against the slab with its right foot. The rock shifted a few inches but remained caught under a root. The bear kept coming, heavy breath, turning white in front of its muzzle. The female Bigfoot placed both young ones against the wall and stepped forward to help the male. Daniel slid the end of his branch into the crack and used it like a lever. All three pushed at once. The root tore from the soil, and the slab crashed down into the passage with a violent impact, dragging loose dirt and dry branches with it. The bear retreated, separated by the fallen rock. The female immediately led the two young ones along the narrow edge toward a lower path near the water. The male followed for several steps, then looked back. Daniel tried to stand, but his ankle could not hold his weight, sending him back against the wall. He thought the creature would keep protecting its family and leave him behind, a reasonable choice in that moment. Instead, the male Bigfoot turned back, lowered itself, and extended its healthy arm toward him. Daniel grabbed the thick fur on its forearm. The creature pulled him upright, held the back of his jacket, and guided him across the slick ledge. Behind them, the bear began pushing against the rock with its full weight. When the group reached the water's edge, the female pointed downstream, where Daniel might find a way back to Brooks' camp. The male looked the opposite way, then picked up the remaining salmon from a leaf pouch near the rocks. It lifted the fish onto its shoulder and moved upstream, deliberately creating a new scent trail to lead the bear away from both its family and the man it had just saved. The male Bigfoot walked upstream, dragging the salmon across low rocks, so the fish smell would cling to the water and the moss along the bank. The female led both young ones to the forest slope on the other side, while Daniel was set beside a tree root, where he could lean back and see the water ahead. The female touched the branch he was using as a walking stick, then looked downstream, as if reminding him that the path home was there. Above, rock shifted. The white scarred bear had broken through the barrier and returned to the narrow passage, muzzle lifted to find the scent. When it reached the water's edge, it stopped for several seconds, then changed direction to follow the trail the male Bigfoot had deliberately left. Daniel watched the creature move farther upstream and understood the plan relied on patience, not raw strength. The male Bigfoot kept just enough distance, sometimes dragging the fish through brush, then appearing on the opposite side so the bear would continue to see it. Where the water split into two branches, the creature stood on a flat rock, turned, and threw the fish to the opposite bank. The bear immediately went into the water, focusing on the prey caught between stones. The deeper current slowed its steps. The male Bigfoot circled a rock point, followed a strip of dry ground, and returned to its family along another route. When the bear reached the fish, it stopped chasing, dragged the prize onto the bank, and began eating. The male Bigfoot appeared among the trees behind Daniel, left shoulder still hanging low, but its steps less unsteady. The female came forward and touched her forehead to his healthy shoulder. The two young ones hugged their father's legs with a clear relief that carried in the small sounds they made. Daniel watched and understood that the fish that had started the fight had now become the thing that let every living being escape danger. He did not lift the camera. He did not want to intrude on the reunion before him in the cold morning. After a while, the male Bigfoot returned to the rock shelter where the memory card had been hidden. It took the small black object, stepped to a rock near Daniel, and set it down. One finger held the memory card in place, while its eyes looked straight at him, waiting for a decision only Daniel could make. Daniel looked at the memory card beneath the male Bigfoot's finger, and clearly felt that it was no longer just a small, meaningless object in the forest. The creature did not crush it or push it directly back to him. It pointed to the card, then pointed toward the female and the two young ones near the stream bank, then moved its hand toward the forest behind them. Daniel followed each gesture and understood that every image in the device was tied to this family, their shelter, and the secret they had kept for many years. He placed a hand on his chest, nodded slowly, and picked up the card, putting it in the inner pocket of his jacket instead of placing it back into the camera. The male watched the movement until Daniel's hand left the pocket, then stepped back. The older young one suddenly came forward, holding a green moss-covered stone. Daniel recognized it at once as the same stone that had dropped onto the cabin roof the night before. That discovery made him understand at least one member of the family had approached the camp before the river encounter, perhaps to observe, test his reaction, or mark the presence of a human. The young one placed the stone in Daniel's palm and quickly retreated to its mother. He closed his fingers around the cold, damp surface, feeling the small gesture as a confirmation rather than a gift. Daniel lifted the stone to his chest and bowed his head slightly, answering the trust he had been given. The female led the young ones into the forest, though the smallest still looked back at him several times before vanishing among the willows. The male Bigfoot stayed. It pointed downstream, took several steps in that direction, then looked back at Daniel. He leaned on the branch and stood, understanding that the creature was leading him toward Brooks River. The Bigfoot moved more slowly than before, always stopping at slick ground or bear tracks so Daniel could keep up. It chose flatter routes, broke low branches that blocked the way, and kept enough distance that he would not feel dragged. When the forest began thinning, the sound of the river grew clearer. Near the old fishing area, the Bigfoot placed an intact Chinook salmon on a rock, then looked at Daniel in silence. He did not know whether it was repayment, thanks, or a reminder. Before the creature turned back into the woods, Daniel heard people calling his name from downstream. Mark was the first to appear at the river bend, followed by 2 rangers carrying a first aid kit and a folding stretcher. When he saw Daniel sitting against the rock, right ankle swollen and jacket covered with mud, Mark immediately stepped into the shallows and called his name again. Daniel raised a hand in response, feeling both relief and the weight of needing to choose every word carefully. His fishing rod still lay beside the root in the same place, and the Chinook salmon remained untouched on the rock, with no hook mark or claw wound. Mark knelt to check Daniel's ankle and asked where he had been for so many hours. Daniel said he had heard bear activity upstream, gone into the forest to observe, and slipped down a rocky slope. One ranger saw several long brown hairs on Daniel's shoulder, reached to examine them, and asked where they had come from. Daniel said they may have caught on him while he crawled through damp brush. The explanation sounded reasonable, but Mark's eyes showed he still had doubts. On the way back to the station, they said several people at the camp had also heard an unusually deep roar echo through the valley. Daniel looked toward the eastern forest and said cliffs and heavy mist often distorted sound. When Mark pointed to the salmon on the rock and asked how he had caught it, Daniel answered that it had been trapped in the shallow water after the chaos. At the ranger station, medical staff determined he had a severe sprain, bruised shoulder, and dehydration, but no sign of broken bone. The camera was scratched, its lens muddy, but the backup memory still held the opening part of the confrontation between the bear and the giant figure. The main memory card remained hidden inside the lining of his jacket, where no one checked. That night, Daniel replayed the audio recorded from the cabin. The 3-tree knocks and deep breathing now carried an entirely different meaning. When he watched the final frame, he realized the Bigfoot had looked straight at the camera before leaving the river, as if it had known Daniel was present long before Daniel believed it did. Daniel sat silently before the screen, fingers closed around the stone. Understanding the search had ended, but his responsibility had only begun. After returning to Oregon with his ankle still braced, Daniel spent his first days organizing everything he had brought back from Alaska. He backed up the memory card onto a hard drive disconnected from the internet, placed the device inside a safe, then opened the footage on an old computer. The image was shaky, dim, and often blocked by branches, but still clear enough to show the male Bigfoot moving on 2 legs, standing against the bear and carrying the salmon into the forest. Another clip captured part of the ravine and 2 small shadows near the female Bigfoot. Daniel enlarged each frame, compared the creature's height against trees, checked the GPS times, and matched the location with a Brooks River map. The more he watched, the more he understood the shock these images could cause if they appeared in public. Daniel drafted an email to a biologist who studied Alaskan wildlife, attached 1 photo, then stopped before pressing send. He read more stories about locations that had been flooded by crowds after rumors of rare animals spread. The articles made him imagine photography groups, curious strangers, armed men, and people hoping to make money from mystery. His phone rang when Emily, his daughter, called to ask about the trip. Daniel told her he had encountered a bear, fallen, and been lucky to be found before the weather turned worse. He held back the most important part, though the silence made his voice slower. Emily reminded him that after retirement, he had once said life rarely surprised him anymore. Daniel looked at the frame of the Bigfoot family sharing Salmon beside the rock shelter and said this trip had made him rethink many things. After the call, he returned to the unsent email, deleted the attachment, and closed the window. Daniel moved the data to the hard drive, placed it in the safe with the moss-covered stone, and wrote one line on the outside: "Do not release until the consequences are understood." Before turning off the computer, he watched the final frame again. The older young Bigfoot was holding the strip of blue fabric once tied to the branch. Daniel realized it was part of the strap from a backpack he had lost during last year's trip. The discovery made him understand. This family may have known about him for a long time. The next day, Daniel quietly booked his return to Brooks River for the following September. But this time, he decided to leave the professional camera at home.